Hello, everyone. I would like to speak today about the meaning of houses in astrology. So, it seems like understanding houses is one of the building blocks of chart interpretation. But the reason why I felt inspired to speak about this topic today is because there's a growing, maybe controversy about the way to interpret houses. So, my point of view is that there are different approaches to astrology, and there shouldn't be just one agreed upon way to read a chart. It all depends on what we're looking for and the questions we're asking and our methods of interpretation. And I will speak today about my method of interpretation. Part of the reason is that I've seen in the world of astrology a lot of criticism about associating houses with signs and planets, such as the first house with the sign of Aries and the planet Mars, and so forth. Um, I wrote a book personally that is titled Neptune, the 12th house in Pisces. So, right there in the title, I made sure that people understood that my approach would be more archetypal. And that's what the correlation, the association with houses and sign for me is about. It's about understanding that there is a thematic resonance between the houses and signs and the planets. So let's begin. I hope we'll demonstrate how the houses come about and what is the process leading from one house to another. And I will try to get also into why I feel that there is absolute relevance to understanding the correlation of signs with houses. So the book that I wrote, Neptune, the 12th house in Pisces, captures the thematic archetypal approach to understanding houses and sign. Moreover, I also use the modern rulers. So Neptune, to me, is the primary ruler of Pisces. Before its discovery, Pisces was obviously ruled by Jupiter. My sense is from what I have observed, and it took me about 17 years to write this book, I do see that Neptune definitely captures the essence of the sign of Pisces more deeply. And so it is for Pluto and Scorpio, and so it is for Uranus and Aquarius. Now, again, this is my perspective. My approach is based on evolutionary astrology, which is, quite a vague and wide umbrella. Not all evolutionary astrologers are going to interpret the chart exactly the same way. There are differences among me and my colleagues. However, one of the common premise is that we're going to interpret the chart by understanding the soul journey. So we use the chart as a way to understand why we're here, what is the purpose of our lives, and get this more, spiritual meaning to our analysis. And this means basically that from an evolutionary point of view, if you define something in astrology, for example, you say, your mother was very controlling, or you're a good carpenter. We don't stop there. We want to understand why your soul had to experience a mother that had, anxiety and needed to control things. And what is the purpose of you being a carpenter? Where does it come from? What are you trying to build? So we're looking at astrology from a more process-oriented approach. We're not just looking at the outcome, but looking at the core reason as much as possible. Now, just, if you are interested in this line of thinking and you feel that you resonate with this knowledge, I invite you to visit my website as well. You'll find videos and articles, and I would encourage you to definitely study astrology if you want to take astrology to a very deep level and master the art of chart analysis, which is the hardest thing, because astrology is not just about learning about houses or about Jupiter and this or that planet, and it's about the ability to synthesize everything, to look at all the pieces in the chart and be able to build a narrative that is going to be impactful, that is going to be accurate, and is going to make a difference in your client's life. So it's an investment to study in astrology. This particular program, the comprehensive diploma program, is quite rigorous. It's 2 to 3 years at least. It's a lot of self-study, and there are some written assignments. So you are really supervised. And even though a lot of it is self-study, there's a lot we work together in both theory and practice. And of course, readings if you're interested in your own personal soul journey. But let's get to our house meaning. So what are houses? Importantly, you know about the ascendant probably. I assume that most of you who are watching this video have some background in astrology, but if you don't, well, you have the band of the signs, which are basically on what we call the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the path of the sun. So the sun is going through these signs in the course of 1 year. Now, 1 year is roughly 365 days, which it correlates to the whole wheel of 360 degrees. So the sun moves on average slightly faster than 1 degree per day. And the other planet, all the planets part of the solar system are on that ecliptic band, and they've, in their own pace, their own rhythm, are more or less around that same band, going through the signs. Signs are often also associated with the constellations that the sun goes through. So the Aries sign relates to the Aries constellation and so forth. But there's a difference between signs and constellations, because signs are 30 degrees equal. They're all the same size, whereas constellations are different in size. Aries is a very small constellation. Virgo is a very big constellation. So they're not neatly divided as we do in astrology. So keep in mind that signs are maybe symbolically associated with the constellations, but they are technically not the same thing. So we know what the signs are, and we're going to look at other graphics to help you also visualize that. What are the houses? The houses are defined in most systems by the horizon, which is the ascendant and the descendant lines that basically divide the hemispheres. between the upper hemisphere, what is above us and we can see, and the lower hemisphere, which is under the earth and we cannot see. So when the sun rises east, this is the ascendant is the eastern horizon. When the sun rises east, or when a planet rises east, we can see it. Then when it sets west and crosses the descendant line, we don't see it anymore. So what are we actually seeing here? And we're going to again show more graphics. Basically, the houses begin with the ascendant, descendant, the horizon, and also the MCIC, medium Celli, imminent Celli, or midheaven for the MC. And what is the midheaven? It's where the local meridian, where you live, actually crosses the path of the sun, the sign, and the ecliptic. So what we are actually saying is that houses are about your geographical place of birth. Because where you are, where you were born, if you looked east, you would see what sign is rising. And that would determine what your ascendant sign is. Now, this changes if you are in one location or another. If I'm born in New York City at 5 p.m., there is going to be a sign on the horizon that is going to be different than if I were born in Paris. So 5 p.m. in New York City is going to be about 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. in Paris. So two babies born at the same time but at different locations will have a different horizon. So this is why in astrology, when we build a chart, we need to know what time you were born and what place you were born to determine specifically at the place of birth what was on the horizon, east and west, and then MCIC. So these are the four intersections between our earthly plane and our celestial plane. In other words, if we didn't have houses and we only had signs and planets going through the signs, we would not be able to bring the heavens to earth. So in a way, the houses represent the way we experience those signs. You know, if the sun is in Sagittarius, what house is it in is going to determine what my personal experience of Sagittarius is going to be in my physical location. So as we said, someone in New York City will experience the sun in Sagittarius in a different place, in a different house than someone born at the same time in France. In other words, the houses are earthing the sky. They bring a point of reference between the heavens to the earth. It's a way of basically downloading, if you will. In other words, these angles, we call them the angles, the horizon, ascendant, descendant, MCIC, are the meeting points between the earth, our geographical position, and the sky. And it's an important division because, as we said, otherwise we won't be able to make a distinction between a person born here and China. It is, if you don't have the houses to understand those differences, the sun will be in Sagittarius for everyone. It's not going to be specific. So let's look at it more astronomically in this image. So the green curve down below is the Earth, and it should be flat because we usually don't live in a valley like that. But, in order to see the whole sky, I had to distort the image a little bit. So what do you see here? At the eastern point, you have the constellation of Leo rising, and then Cancer is up here, and then Gemini, and you see Mars is up here. Then this green line that is going up is the meridian. So where you're located, every place on Earth has a particular meridian. So your local meridian is also crossing the sky and the ecliptic at some point. So what is this yellow band? Is where the sun is going. This is the ecliptic. It's called the path of the sun. And this is also where all the planets circulate. Now, they can be a little north or a little south of the ecliptic because there's a range. Like you see here, the planet Mars is very close to the ecliptic, but it's slightly above it. Now, and Mercury here is conjunct Neptune, and it's a little south of the ecliptic. But they're more or less around it. So all the planets and the sun are going through this yellow path. And where the yellow path meets our horizon, our eastern horizon, is our ascendant. And the opposite sign to the west is going to be our descendant. Now, for most house systems, the ascendant is going to be the beginning of the first house. The descendant, beginning of the seventh house. As we see here, ascendant first house, descendant seventh house, going counterclockwise. Then the MC, where the meridian meets the ecliptic, is the 10th house, and the opposite sign below the Earth is the IC, the 4th house. In other words, these are the main angles, and these are the natural intersection points. The other houses, 11, 12, and 2, 3, and 5, 6, and 8, 9, are called inner houses. And they can vary from house system to house system. So in what we call quadrant house systems, where the ascendant is the first house and the MC is the 10th house beginning, such as Porphyry, Placidus, or Koch, there is no change in the angles. This 3-house system will have the same ascendant and the same MC axis. But where they will differ is going to be the inner houses. And again, this is a topic for another discussion. We're not going to get into the different house systems. We're going to get into the interpretation of the houses here. So now look at this chart and you see the sky. Now let's draw the actual chart of that moment. And this is it. And you see Leo was above the horizon, rising. Virgo was exactly on the eastern horizon. We don't see it in this graph, we only see Leo. There's a reason why. There's a 23-degree gap between the actual constellations and the signs, okay? So this is the constellation of Leo. This is the constellation of Cancer, and you see very different in size. Leo is much larger than Cancer. This is, for example, the Aries constellation is very small, whereas the Taurus constellation is huge. So signs are slightly different from constellation. We said they're the same size. So there's going to be a slight difference between what you see in the sky and what you see in the chart. However, it's, as far as the planets are concerned, they are going to be more or less where they appear in the astronomy chart. You see Mars here is very close to the intersection between the meridian and the ecliptic, close to the MC. And indeed, Mars is here, conjunct the south north node. You see Mercury, Neptune, conjunct, close to the descendant, about to set. And here they are astronomically. You see the sun here, it's a bright light. So you assume that if the sun is about to set, you know, it's about a couple, 2 to 3 hours before it's going to set. This is a chart that is likely around 3 or 4 p.m. when the sun is approaching the setting point. And here it is in Aries, couple of hours before setting. You don't see the moon because everything that's below the horizon is not visible to us. We only see the upper hemisphere. So what I want to better explain as we go through these graphics is what is the meaning of the houses. And as I said, to me, it's very important to understand that astrology works archetypically from an archetypal point of view, and that the 12 signs are basically a reference to 12 primary forces that represents everything in life. Everything that you experience, everything that you see, everything that is represented by the 12 signs. And so by definition, it makes sense that the 12 houses will also correlate to these 12 archetypes. Now, I don't just want to speak about what makes sense to me. I would also like to demonstrate how I see it work and give you some food for thought that is not just speculation or theory, but actual practice. So bear with me. I hope, we won't spend hours here trying to speak about this thing. But, what some astrologers are calling, for example, there was an astrologer named Zipporah Dobbins, and she referred to a term called the 12-letter alphabet, speaking basically about 12 signs, 12 houses, and reference to the planet ruling each sign, 10 planets ruling the 12 houses. And she made a point also correlating not just the first house in Aries, but mutual receptions. For example, Venus in the 4th house is thematically correlating to Venus in Cancer, but this can also relate to a moon in Taurus. It has a thematic association and correlation. More about that later. So there are different approaches to astrology: Vedic, traditional, medieval, Hellenistic, which tend to be more predictive and fate-oriented, even though that's not an absolute, it's a generalization. Whereas the modern approach is more referred to humanistic, Jungian or psychological, and then evolutionary, esoteric, and that refers to the more process-oriented analysis of a chart, more psychological and growth-oriented. Some people will say, that the modern approach takes more into consideration the free will factor rather than the fate. So understanding that we can make a difference in our chart. But it's not absolutely accurate because, at least from my practice, which is leaning towards, is more evolutionary, my point of view is that we need to both incorporate the fated aspect of life and the free will aspect of life. So there are some things we cannot change, and there are some things that we can. For example, we cannot change our chart. You're born at a particular moment, you're fated to live that particular chart. If you're a Sagittarius, you cannot be a Leo. Doesn't matter how hard you try or how hard you wish, it's fated. And it's fated based on your karma. So from an evolutionary point of view, I will ask myself, why did this soul choose this particular moment? And why did they choose to incarnate as a Sagittarius or as a Scorpio? Let's try to understand the thread. Let's try to understand where they're coming from, what they're trying to do, where are they at in their evolutionary journey. So between all the systems, there are definitely overlapping principles and foundations. We all work with 12 signs. We all work, we all measure transits. However, there are differences in interpretation and even in association. For example, as an evolutionary astrologer, I will use the modern rulers, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, modern rulers to the signs of Neptune Pisces, Uranus Aquarius, Pluto Scorpio, whereas traditional astrologer may use the traditional rulers that were before the discovery of the new planets. Now, I'm not going to argue who's right, because we're both right. The same way we're going to differ on the way we interpret houses. If you work with traditional techniques and measurements, it may make sense to have a different interpretation of houses. If you work with horary astrology, which is questions, that are, you cast a chart for the moment you ask a question. The traditional interpretation of houses may work well for that, and it may not be appropriate to conflate sign to houses. But if you want to work with my approach, and if you want to understand astrology from that soul journey point of view, you will see that there's a lot of importance and important references and a lot of information and accurate meaning to associate house and sign. This basically, what I want to say is that I'm not doing that because it's easy. I'm not doing that because I'm superficial and I just want a quick fix. And, why complicate my life in trying to separate houses and signs let's find an easy formula to teach astrology and say that they're the same. That's not where I'm coming from. The reason why I'm using an association with house and sign is because I tested it and because I do see it working, and and my clients seem to resonate with what I'm saying, and I can have a feedback mechanism that validates what I'm trying to say. So the reason why I'm constantly trying to explain myself here is I see more and more articles and books and astrologers coming against other astrologers who are very comfortable with merging houses with signs. And I don't know why that is. Like, do your astrology, let me do mine. And most importantly, let's help our clients. So let's tolerate diversity. Let's tolerate different approaches and refrain from labeling modern astrologers superficial, or to project on modern astrologers the fanciful or the new age superficial association, as if we don't do our own research. That's my point of view. So there is a difference between sign, planets, and houses, of course. They are not the same thing. What we're talking about is a thematic resonance, not the same application. If you have Venus in the 4th house, you cannot say I have Venus in Cancer. You can say there's a resonance to Venus in Cancer, but it's not the same. The reason is that the signs, where the planet is, where the planets travel, is a way of operation. The planet is the actual ambassador and the activator, but the house is the area of life. So if we speak about, let's say, the 4th house and the sign of Cancer and the moon as the ruler, understand the sign of Cancer is the sign that represents our need to process emotionally everything about our existence. Cancer represents the gestation process. It represents our need to assimilate and therefore to emotionally connect with our home, with our family, with people around us, with our ideas, with our identity, with our country. So as we emotionally connect, we develop ourselves and our identity. Let's say, for example, I'm an astrologer, so I'm emotionally connected to the field of astrology, and everything that happens in the world of astrology will affect me or will raise my interest. Now, I may know mentally about electricians and about other professions, but I'm not emotionally connected to electricians because it's not my identity. So Cancer relate to this capacity to emotionally resonate with, associate with, and internalize. And this is why Cancer relates to, the development of our personality. So the planet, the moon, is the ambassador of Cancer. So wherever we have a moon is how, we'll see, where are we sending that emotional processor? Where are we sending that ability to emotionally connect and develop an identity. If the moon is in the sign of Sagittarius, I'm going to be emotionally associated with ideologies, with a particular religion, or maybe with the need to have meaning in my life. So there's going to be an emotional charge to my philosophies, to my belief systems. And this is going to define me. You know, my ideologies and beliefs and way of and meaning in life is going to define who I am and how I'm proceeding with life. And the way I'm going to process everything is going to be through a Sagittarian lens, which means I need to conceptualize everything. If I'm eating food with the moon in Sagittarius, I want to know, you know, where culturally that food is coming from. I would like to understand, you know, why should I eat vegan or why should I eat keto diet? So I'm going to have some kind of philosophical identification with everything I do in my life to a degree or another. The house is in what area of my life this applies to. So if this happens to be in my 7th house, which is a house of relationships, the house is neutral. You know, it's just said this is the area of relationship. It doesn't tell you how many, where. You need the sign and the planets to define the house, how it operates. So if the 7th house is the house of relationships, then I'm looking at Sagittarius there to say how I'm approaching relationships. And then if the moon is in Sagittarius in the 7th house, it's going to add the emotional identification. So if I have Sagittarius in the 7th house, my approach to relationship is again going to be philosophical. I'm going to attract partners who are thinkers, who can debate with me, who may come from different cultures. And with the moon there, I'm going to be very interested to hear the different ideologies and to see how other people, 7th house, can influence my own ideas and beliefs and my own ideologies. Maybe this person is going to convert to another religion by association with relationships. So what I want to basically make sure we all understand is that we use sign, planets, and houses differently, even though the themes may be similar. So one thing to understand, you know, from an astronomical point of view, why is there any kind of association with signs and houses? When we look at the globe and we say that houses are definitely location sensitive. If you are born in Brazil, your horizon is going to be different than if you're born in Australia or China. So every location has a different sky. It's still the same signs, and you know the sun may still be in Aries wherever you are. If it's the month of March and April, the sun is in Aries for everybody on the globe, but it's going to be somewhere different at every time depending on your location. Now, there's such a thing called the Tropic of Cancer, the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn. And the Tropic of Cancer is a line that basically, a latitude that crosses the globe at around 23.5 degrees north. And the opposite is 23.5 degrees south, is the Tropic of Capricorn. What is that? So, the sun and the earth have obviously an ongoing dance. They dance around each other. Mostly the earth is rotating around the sun. But if we look astrologically, we look at ourselves as the center and we see the sun rotating around the earth. That's our subjective perspective. But you see that there's a tilt. The earth is not exactly perpendicular to the sun. It's tilted at 23.5 degrees. And this is why in June, the north face of the earth is facing the sun. And in June, it's going to be warmer in the northern hemisphere. Now, if you're here and you look at the sun, what is going to be in the backdrop? Cancer, Gemini. So that's the solstice point. The sun is going to be in the backdrop of the signs of Cancer and Gemini in June. So you're not looking at what's behind the earth. You're looking at where the earth is facing towards the sun and in the backdrop. Opposite is the December solstice, December 21st, where it's the south side at 23-degree tilt that is going to face the sun. And that's why it's summer in December in the southern hemisphere. As opposed to these two, which are the equinoxes, and these are the middle point when it's equal night and day on the planet. So the March equinox in where the sun is in Aries, and the September equinox when the sun enters Libra. So this is where the tropical zodiac that most Western astrologers use is rooted in this particular timing, where when the earth is at maximum tilt towards the north, the sign of Cancer begins. Maximum tilt towards the south, the sign of Capricorn builds. Equal east and west is Aries and Libra. And we start to see now that there is a resonance between the directions. Cancer is north. Capricorn is south. Aries is east. And Libra is west. That is a truth that derives from this tilt. If you look at the way the earth is tilted, it will point towards the sign of Cancer with its North Pole in the month of June. And it will tilt towards the South Pole in the sign of Capricorn in December. That's true everywhere you are on the planet. And by association, Aries is going to be east and Libra is going to be west. So if we go back to this globe, what happens on the June 21st solstice? If the sun is, because of the tilt, the sun is going to be overhead at noon on this line, 23 north. And on December 21st, on the Tropic of Capricorn, the sun is going to be overhead at noon on the December 21st. So basically, in the course of the year, as the Earth shifts its tilt, it's going to show that latitude, 23.5 north, is going to be right in front of the sun. So the sun is going to be right overhead on that particular latitude. And in December, it's going to be the opposite. Whereas in the equinoxes, where it's equal night and day, the sun is going to be overhead on the equator. What I'm trying to say here is that there is a correlation between the signs and the houses in their direction. Remember, going back here, that the ascendant is the eastern horizon. And the descendant is the western horizon. Now, if you leave in the northern hemisphere, going back to that map, if you live somewhere here in Spain, where do you see the sun? You see it south, because the sun is going to go above and then set south of your location. The sun will not go overhead beyond 23.5 degree latitude. This is why when we look at a chart and we see the MC is going to be the direction south and then the direction west. Now this shifts if you live in the southern hemisphere, because in the southern hemisphere, east is going to be on your right and west is going to be on your left. And north is going to be where the sun is. You look at the sun north at the ecliptic rather than south. So in a way, you would need, if we were to draw this accurately, we would have the ascendant, Virgo ascendant. It's still going to be Virgo ascendant, but you would mirror this chart, and east would be to the right side. In order to simplify and standardize the chart, we keep it like that for both hemispheres. But it's important in this particular understanding to understand that north is the sign of Cancer. East is the sign of Aries. South is the sign of Capricorn. That's universal. It doesn't matter where you live. Capricorn is always going to be south. Aries is always going to be east. Cancer is always going to be north, and Libra is always going to be west. If we look at this particular graph, we can see it again. So you see the same tilt. This is the Earth. This is an illustration from Gemini Brett, and I would like to thank him. He's also the one who advanced the idea of the directional zodiac, understanding that the signs represents particular directions, no matter where you are in the globe. And we see this in this particular illustration. So we see the North Pole leaning towards Cancer, South Pole leaning towards Capricorn. Now, what is Aries and what is Libra? when the plane of the Earth intersects with the plane of the sun. So the yellow disk is the sun path. The blue disk is the Earth equator path. And they meet at these 2 points. The time that they meet determines, from a tropical astrology point of view, this is Aries, always. So Aries is always east, 21st of March. The opposite for Libra. And that's why we have equal day and night, because that's when there's no, the tilt doesn't affect the visibility of the sun. So this may seem a bit heady, but I just want to bring a reference to the fact that the direction of the signs also correlates with the direction of the houses, at least as far as the horizon goes. You see that this is a nice illustration to see that the sun doesn't always rise and set, exactly east and exactly west. So this is the December solstice. So December solstice, the sun is going to be rising southeast. And as you move into January, it's going gradually, it's still southeast, but a little less and a little less. And then on the March equinox, that's when the sun rises exactly due east. And from that point on, it's going to move north, and it's going to set further north and further north until it reaches the June solstice. And it reaches its maximum northern latitude, roughly, talked about 23 degrees. And once it reaches the June solstice and the full north, it's going to backtrack and go back a little closer to the center until it reaches in the September equinox the same alignment that it reached in March, exactly due east. And then from September, it's going to go back to cross through the south again. And then in December, you see the same setting, rising and setting points. We can also look at it from, this is a flat map of the constellations. And you can see here 0 latitude, declination, 30 north, 30 south. So you see, here 0 is the beginning of Pisces and the beginning of Virgo. Excuse me, here 0 is beginning of Virgo and beginning of Pisces. And the reason again is because these are constellations versus signs. So there's a 24-degree gap between the constellations and the signs. And as we said, they also differ in size. But it gives you a general understanding, a general overview of the north signs and then the southern signs. Now, I want to show you something else. So this is a chart that shows you how we build the houses originally, focusing on the path of the sun and the other planets and luminary. So this is a chart for 6:30 in the morning. So the sun just rose. This is the horizon. So east was 29 degrees Pisces, and the sun just rose above the horizon. And I'm going to advance this particular chart by the hour. And you're going to see what happens. An hour later, the ascendant, because of the rotation of the earth spins on itself. Therefore, the horizon on the same location, if I'm in New York City and the earth spins, the horizon is going to go down. And I'm going to face another sign on the eastern horizon and another sign on the western horizon. So as the ascendant shifts signs and moves counterclockwise, it pushes all the planets clockwise. Because even though they're both moving in the same direction, the sun, the moon, and the ascendant are moving counterclockwise. Because the ascendant moves faster, the rotation of the earth on itself takes 24 hours for a full circle through the 12 signs. It looks as though the sun and the moon are moving back. Think about, you're in traffic and two cars move in the same direction, but one car moves faster than the other. It may appear as though one car is moving backwards, but it isn't. It's just an optic illusion. So, this is 7:30 a.m. The sun and the moon are in the 12th house, and at 8:30 in the 11th house, 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, and around noon, they are on that intersection between the meridian and the ecliptic. So they're at that culmination point. And from there, they start to set. And so on a daily motion level, you see that the planets are moving actually from the 12th to the 11th to the 10th and moving clockwise. This is why some people say that the way they number the houses is by telling which planet is going to rise in first. So planets in the first house are going to be the first to rise. Planets in the second house are going to be the second to rise. In the third house, third to rise. In the 12th house, if you have planets in the 12th house, it's going to take that long for them to rise again. That's one interpretation. What we want to retain is that there are two motions in our zodiac. There is the daily motion, where all planets move almost exactly at the same speed, clockwise on a daily motion, and they move from house to house. And therefore, if you're born, at 3:30, you're going to have the sun likely in the 8th house. If you're born around 5, you're going to have the sun in the 7th house. And if you're born after the sunset, it's going to be in the 6th house. The other planets could be anywhere. We're only talking about the sun motion here. However, they each move roughly the same speed daily. And I say roughly because, as you can see, there are gaps growing between the sun and the moon. Now, if we change this direction and illustration, now I'm going to move the planets per day and look at the motion of the moon and the sun. The ascendant, excuse me. That's not a good example because so the ascendant, there was daylight saving time on this particular day. So that's why there was a big gap. Let me remove the daylight savings time. So here we go. That's 24 hours later. This was March 13, March 14, March 15. See how the moon is moving counterclockwise, and so is the sun. So the moon is moving from the 12th to the 1st, to the 2nd, to the 4th, 5th, 6th, etc., until the next one, until the next new moon. And the sun is also progressing from Pisces to Aries. So moving counterclockwise from the 12th to the 1st, to the 2nd, and so forth. What we want to retain from this illustration is we have the daily motion where all the planets are pushed by the ascendant backwards, clockwise, whereas the solar system motion is counterclockwise, and all the planets move from the first house to the second house, from Pisces to Aries to Taurus. So in the sky, we see the planets, if we track them on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, we see them shifting counterclockwise. But if we look at them daily, on a 24-hour basis, they will move clockwise. Why is that important? Because it shows again that there is an importance to the sequence of the houses. That the sun is in the first, and then it's going to move to the second, and then it's going to move to the third, if as it goes through the cycles of transits and the cycles of the zodiac. So what I want to basically convey here is that there is a natural connection between each house. One leads to another. So if we go by this philosophy and associate Aries with the first house, it's going to be naturally ruled by Mars. Now, it doesn't mean that Aries is going to be on the cusp of the first house, but it means that it's associated by theme. It's the same similar theme. But there could be any sign on the first house. I trust you all understand that. So here in this chart, the first house is an Aries house, and it means that the meaning of the house has Aries qualities. And that means it's a house of birthing. It's a house of ignition. It's the house where you develop your individuality, where you learn to take on challenges. So the first house has to do with facing obstacles. The same way Aries relates to being able to fight for them and to be vital and to overcome challenges. The sign that's on that house is going to tell us how that is going to apply. So if I have Aquarius rising, I'm going to address the first house matters in an Aquarian way. And I'm going to expand on that later. And so it goes for all the other ones. So naturally, if we look at the natural archetypal zodiac, we see it like that. First house, Aries, Mars, second house, Venus, Taurus, etc. Remember that the eastern horizon is related to the eastern sign, the western horizon with the western sign of Libra, and the IC north is going to relate to the northern sign of Cancer. And so there is a natural astronomical resonance between the sign and planets. Now, how did I come about making that correlation? And how do we apply this? I'm going to get into the deeper meaning of each house, but I first want to demonstrate that we should pay attention to the association between house and sign. So no, I didn't, some say, well, people do that because some of their teachers did that and they just regurgitate whatever they've been told. They don't know why they actually conflate house and sign. Some people say it's because they want to, it's an oversimplification of astrology and it distorts the meaning of the houses. The houses have very different meanings that have nothing to do with the signs, and it's an error to try to connect them. Well, I want to prove a different point of view. First of all, if I came to this association, it's not because my teacher did it. I took a lot of things from my teachers, and I rejected other things from my teacher. I did not systematically, blindly follow principles that were taught to me. So let's not basically oversimplify, again, the reason why astrologers do that. I'm certainly not someone who's looking for superficial quick fixes. So let's get this out of the way as well. So how did I start to make that correlation between house and sign? Is I started to observe charts. And in my very family, we are 3 siblings. I have the moon in the 12th house. One of my siblings has the moon in Pisces, and my third sibling has a moon-Neptune south node conjunction. Well, is that a coincidence? Moon, 12th house, Neptune, Pisces. It's just one case. It can be just a coincidence. I mean, what unites siblings, if not the moon, they share the same family. They have the same mother, same family dynamics. And indeed, if I were to define our family atmosphere, there was a strong Piscean 12th house Neptunian quality to it. My mother was very devotional and sacrificed a lot. There were circumstances in our family life that pressured, compelled her to make many personal sacrifices because my father was sick. And she had to basically, sacrifice a lot of her needs for the family, for the community, and do many things that he, couldn't do because of his handicap. So we each have a different placement, but there's a resonance that we all experience, the same family dynamics. But again, one example is not enough to reach any conclusion. It's just a starting point. Now, this is another client. And she's in the inner wheel. So she's the Gemini born on on an eclipse, a new moon on the North Node. This is a solar eclipse in the 8th house and in Gemini. Interestingly, her father is born on a new moon, sort of close to a new moon, but it's an eclipse. It's the day of an eclipse in Scorpio. It's also conjunct the nodes. So, new moon on the nodes, new moon on the nodes. Lo and behold, they have the same nodes as well. So, his daughter is born on his nodal return. Interestingly, hers is in the 8th house and his is in Scorpio. Again, thematic resonance. Her Mars conjunct Saturn in Scorpio. Saturn rules Capricorn. His Mars is in Capricorn. Is there a resonance to her Mars Saturn in Scorpio and to his Mars in Capricorn? I don't know what house it's in, but it's in the sign of Capricorn and in the planet ruling Capricorn. Now, does that mean that Mars Saturn in Scorpio is exactly the same as Mars in Capricorn? No. There are other factors to consider here. It's in her 1st house. It's in Scorpio. So there are many other factors to consider. But as far as the Capricorn energy is about, there is indeed a resonance. Both of them are hard workers. Both of them, are people who believe in self-reliance and are very determined in what they do. Here's another family example. This is 5 charts, and each of the chart of the 2 parents and 3 children. This is the chart of the father. So the father is a Sagittarius, born with the Sun-Venus conjunction, squaring Pluto. Look at the nodes in the 10th house. Mercury conjunct Saturn, and he has a T-square between Mars, Uranus, and Jupiter. So Mars opposing Jupiter, square Uranus. The mother, his wife, is born on a new moon in Scorpio, conjunct Mars and Neptune. So a new moon sandwich between Mars and Neptune. Her nodes are also in the 10th fourth. Her Mercury squares Saturn. So his Mercury conjunct Saturn, her Mercury squares Saturn. Interesting. She's a Scorpio. He's a Sun Pluto. Interesting. Firstborn, nodes in the 10th fourth, reversed. So look at that. The mom has a south node 23 Aquarius. The sun has the north node 22 Aquarius. Same ascendant, 7 Gemini, 5 Gemini. Now, he's a sun in Scorpio conjunct Pluto. We start to see a pattern here. Father is Sun square Pluto in Sag. Mom is Sun in Scorpio. Widely sextile Pluto, but just in Scorpio. And the Sun has both the Scorpio and the aspect to Pluto. Interestingly, we see Jupiter opposing Uranus. Jupiter in Aquarius. Jupiter square Uranus. So, if Uranus is associated with Aquarius, Jupiter Uranus, Jupiter in Aquarius, Jupiter Uranus. His father is a Sagittarian. And here we see Sun, Jupiter, exact trine, 10 degrees. Second Sun. Oh, let me backtrack. Another thing that is interesting, the moon here is in Sagittarius, conjunct Venus. So the father has the Sun in Sagittarius conjunct Venus, square Pluto. The mother doesn't. The Sun has a moon in Sagittarius, conjunct Venus. The second Sun has a moon Jupiter. Moon in Sag, moon Jupiter. Sun in Scorpio, Sun Pluto, Sun Pluto in Scorpio, Sun Pluto opposition. Moon Jupiter opposition. Mercury Saturn, Mercury square Saturn, Mercury sextile Saturn, Mercury in the 10th house, a Saturnian house. Daughter, last born, also Mercury in the 10th house. Sun in Libra. Moon in the 9th house. Sun trines Jupiter. So let's look at the moon pattern. Moon in Sag, first Sun. Moon Jupiter, second Sun. Moon in the 9th house, third daughter. Uranus conjunct Jupiter in Aquarius. No aspect between Uranus and Jupiter. Uranus opposition Jupiter. Jupiter in Aquarius quincunx Uranus. Jupiter, Uranus square. So basically, if we look at those different themes, I put this table to see that there are repeating themes in this family. And if we speak of family, like we said, they're born in the same family atmosphere, the 3 kids at least. They will naturally draw from what the parents express and what they share. So it's interesting to see that, yes, sometimes you will see very different combinations that go back to the same resonance. If we look at the moons of the children, first moon in Sagittarius, second moon opposing Jupiter, third moon in the 9th house. You can say random, just happens to be. Well, it happened in my family. It happens again in this family of 3 kids. It's getting to be more intriguing. At least it brings the benefit of doubt that there may be actually a correlation between houses and signs. Mother is a Scorpio, father is a Sun Pluto, firstborn is Sun Pluto Scorpio, secondborn is Sun Pluto. Daughter has a sextile between Sun and Pluto. Mother has Venus in the 5th house in Libra. 5th house is solar. Father is a Sun Venus, solar Venus, 5th house Venus. First son is a Libra in the 5th house. The second son is not a Libra, but he's a Venus sign, Taurus. And then the daughter is a Sun in Libra. So Sun Venus father gives a son with a Sun in Taurus and a daughter with a Sun in Libra. 5th house Libra for this first son, and Venus 5th house Libra for the mother. Sun again. Father is Sun in Sagittarius. First son is Sun Jupiter trine. Secondborn Sag in the 5th. Daughter Sun Jupiter trine. Let's look at it again. Father is a Sun in Sag, conjunct Venus. Mother doesn't have it. Firstborn is Sun Jupiter trine. Secondborn has Sag in the 5th house. And thirdborn is a Sun Jupiter trine again. Now you may say, again, it's far-fetched. I'm saying you may be missing the point if you think it's far-fetched. Because there's a lot of information here that can be very useful for your interpretation. And to understand that these seemingly unrelated sun, the one is in Scorpio, the other one's in Libra, the other one's in Taurus, they may seem completely unrelated if you don't look at it that way, if you don't understand that there's a resonance between house sign and planet, and that these people are actually unified in ways that may not be immediately obvious. Same with the Mercury. Mother is a Mercury-Saturn square. Father is a Mercury-Saturn conjunction. Son is a Mercury-Saturn sextile. And the two youngest kids have Mercury in the 10th house, which is the natural 10th house of Saturn. And then we see the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions and association. Mother has a quincunx in Aquarius. Father has a first square. Son, firstborn is in opposition. Didn't apply to third son, to secondborn, but the daughter has the conjunction. So out of 5 people, 4 have this alignment. I think it's meaningful. This is another interesting example. I mean, again, you have to come with me on this journey. And hopefully this will make you think. This is the story, it's called Soul Survivor. This is a young boy living in California who had vivid memories, dreams about what was later revealed to be his past lives. And he was obsessed with airplanes and crashing airplanes. And he had a lot of information about how planes were working that were not making any reasonable sense, considering his, he was just a 4-year-old. There was no exposure in the family to airplanes. So the parents started to question the child and to, take notes of his dreams and whatnot. And eventually they started to connect the dots. And all the details that the child was providing led them to a particular person that served in World War II and crashed his plane off the coast of Japan. So he was basically, he died in the war from a plane crash in the ocean. The interesting thing for us astrologers is that we do have the chart of this young kid. And we do have the chart of the pilot that died. So we can compare the two lives from the same soul in different incarnations, which is a fascinating topic. This is what I'm going to teach about at the OPA retreat coming up in April, reincarnation in astrology. But briefly, for the sake of our house system here, I want to demonstrate this chart. So we see the inner wheel is the young boy who's named James. And he's born with Mercury, Sun, Saturn, Mars in Aries. So Mars, Saturn in Aries, you can definitely suspect that he had some kind of memory of being a soldier and being in a war. But for the purpose of our research, it's in the 7th house in Aries. Now, if we look at the outer wheel, this is the chart of the pilot that crashed his plane. And what do we see? The same exact planets, Mars, Mercury, Saturn, Sun, in Libra. It's fascinating. The Saturn is exactly the same degree opposition. The Mercury is exactly the same degree opposition. Not only that, the moon is in the exact opposite sign. So one is born with a sun in Aries, Libra moon, and one is born with a Libra sun and Aries moon. Quite compelling. Now, why is that important to our study? Because if you don't understand the association, or if you don't recognize or validate or agree to the connection between the sign and houses, you may miss here another important connection, is that the 7th house is a house of Libra. And the pilot was all these planets in Libra. So is there a resonance between him being born with all these planets in the 7th house? I think there is. Interestingly, they're also born with exactly the same nodes. So this is a really compelling chart exercise to show you that astrology, first of all, can show you reincarnation. And that there is an immediate connection between one life and another, astrologically. From all the examples I've researched, it's not always as obvious. You know, not everybody is going to be born in their next life with exactly the same nodes and with exactly the same planets in the opposite sign. So it's not a one size fits all. However, it's important to look at these examples and realize that there is something to learn here, and that there is a resonance between the signs and the planets. So we can keep looking very, much deeper about all these associations. You know, you see the Jupiter-Venus in water signs, Jupiter-Venus in water signs, and so forth. But I won't spend more time because I want to cover more material here, and I don't want to take all your time. So how do we what is the meaning of the houses? If the first house is Aries, Mars, the first house relates to new cycles of becoming, how we assert the self. So the house doesn't tell you how, it just gives you an area of experience. It's, the area where we overcome challenges. And I call this the rising wave, because the first house is where you're ignited. It's what you're becoming. It's something that gains more prominence and importance in your life. Second house, associated with Taurus and Venus, represents the integration of spirit into matter. That's when you come into your body, into the physical world. This is why the second house has to do with your physical assets, has to do with land, the same way Taurus does. And it has to do with activation of the senses. Now, when we speak about senses, we also speak about art, music, as well as food, nutrition, and we speak about agriculture, growing food, and surviving on a physical level. When you grow your food, it's also your value, because whatever you grow on your land is what you're going to trade. If you're growing broccoli and you cannot grow apples, you're going to the other house of Venus, the Libra house, where you're going to have trade and exchange of resources. So the second house related to Taurus and Venus represents to what you have. The seventh house of Libra Venus is what you don't have and what you're going to exchange. This is why the second house is what you have, but it's also your worth, because it's how much people are going to pay for what you have, for who you are, for whatever resources you can share. And the seventh house, it represents the trade. So if you come with a strong self-worth in the second house, you're going to be able to have a good deal in your seventh house of relationships. But it's all Venus related. Third house, Gemini, Mercury house, has to do with navigation, how you find your direction in this life, on this earth. So Gemini has to do with figuring things out. This is why it's collecting information. Gemini doesn't want to get lost. It wants to know. And that's what we do with the third house. Whatever is in the third house demonstrate how we collect information. What is our system of study? How our brain functions in order to be able to find our way in the maze of life. And because of that, it also has to do with communication. Because through communication, you gain knowledge, you ask questions. So if you have Capricorn in the third house, you're going to look for information that is credible, that is verified, that is tested. Your style of communication is going to be more cautious. You're going to have to do your research before you speak. Whereas if you have Sagittarius in the third house, you may be more trusting and you may speak your mind more easily than if you have Capricorn. So a different type of communication. Still, this will define how you collect information. Fourth house relates to the Cancerian themes of early family dynamic and your growth process. How you feel safe and how you can internalize life within the security of your home. So the fourth house has to do with safety, with taking time out of the external world into your intimate world. And of course, it has to do with those who protect you, your parents, and those who support you, your support system. And of course, where you belong, where you feel safe, where you're emotionally connected, as is Cancer. Now, what sign is in the fourth house is going to determine what happened with those themes. Where were your parents very liberal? Were your parents conservative? Were they intellectuals or whatever it is? The fifth house represents the father. If the mother is the fourth house, the fifth house is going to be the father and the expectations that are on you from the family. Because the fifth house represents how you continue your line. If the father is a doctor, will the child be a doctor as well? Are they going to carry that? So how you carry the family name and what you do as a next generation. The fifth house has to do with your sense of purpose, with your creativity, and therefore with fertility, because creativity can be artistic, can be entrepreneurial, but is also going to show how you bring children to this world if you want to. So your fertility and also your relationship to your children, how you get along with them, and what's your style of education and so forth. And this relates to Leo as well as the sun. Now, some people, especially in traditional studies, will say there's a conflict here because Leo is a barren sign, whereas the fifth house is children. But that's not my experience. I've never seen a barren Leo. So maybe the barren qualities of Leo apply in a different way that I'm not familiar with because I didn't research it. But as far as having children, Leo love children usually. They act like children. And there's definitely a predisposition to have children, to be, to get pregnant more easily and so forth. Now, of course, I'm generalizing, but I'm going to give you some examples. Let's continue first. Sixth house, Virgo, and Mercury relates to how we create function in our lives, what makes everything work together. This is why it's also the house of health, because if you manage to make things work in your life, you're going to have natural health. So health is not just about diseases. It's also a healthy mindset. It's healthy hygiene. It's a healthy lifestyle. It has to do with your life works. Your life makes sense. And whatever sign is in your sixth house will determine how you can make your life work. What makes things functional for you? So if you have Pisces in the sixth house, your way to make things function is actually intuitive. You improvise a lot. You're not going to be the mental planner. As someone with Virgo in the sixth house, Pisces in the sixth house is going to be more adaptive and is going to make things work as in a flexible way, as in going with the flow more. And so the sixth house has to do with how you maintain things and ultimately your health. So again, Pisces in the sixth house, how do you maintain your health? by simplifying your lifestyle, by being close to nature, right? If you have Leo in the sixth house, how you're going to be healthy is by being expressive. It's by fueling your creativity. That's what's going to make you healthy. And the sixth house specifically is not just how your life works, but it's also your profession and your skills. And so what people can hire you for. So it has to do with your professional environment, your work with colleagues, and anything that has to do with also relationship with employment, anything that has to do with employment. I mean, there are other things in the sixth house, such as farming and function. This is why the sixth house is related to animals, domestic animals, because it has to do with animals of service, service animals, farm animals, cows and donkeys who help you take care of the burden of the workload. Whereas your pets, which are more of your kids, you're not going to milk your dog and sell that. So it's not a resource. So the pets are a fifth house and sun, at least the way I've observed it. The seventh house is where you face inner lack. Up to the sixth house, you're the one working and doing and creating, and you're in touch with yourself. When you move into the seventh house, you start to face your own lack and your own deficiency and your own limitations. So you rise above the horizon and you start to interact with other people and find out what they have. So maybe they can supplement what you lack. This is why the seventh house is where you reach out and you start forming relationships and you open up to receiving. But in order to receive, you have to be able to give something in return. This is where the second house comes in and your assets. So second house leads to the seventh because it's both a Venus association, what you have versus what you lack, what you give versus what you receive. But it's also the continuation of the sixth house because the sixth house is where you maximize your capacity to and where you can demonstrate your skills. And then in the seventh house, you can be working with other people. So you start to cooperate because you need help, basically. The seventh house is where you start to need help and you ask for it. And of course, this also leads to romantic relationships and to the need to find a partner and someone who will balance you and complement you. So everything that has to do with marriage and relationships, definitely seventh house. The eighth house is where you're intimately connected with that partner that you started in the seventh house. So the seventh house is more open to diverse interactions, whereas the eighth house has to do with the intimacy. It's a water, Pluto, Scorpio related house. And it has to do with the fusion, with the actual exchange of energies, the symbiosis, and how you learn you need to trust your partner or other people, because in order to exchange and continue that transaction, you have to bear yourself. You have to take down your defenses. So it's a place where there can be a lot of empowerment and a lot of positive exchange, but it's also a place where there can be violations of trust and betrayal and abandonment issues. The other thing that's related to the eighth house, beyond the intimacy and the exchange, we know traditionally it's related to other people's resources. So it's resources on a material level, but it's also resources on an emotional and spiritual level. But that's how you recharge. That's why, that's going to be the future video I'm going to talk about, the relationship between the planets and their octave, Mars and Pluto. So the first house is where you're ignited. It's a Mars house, but the eighth house is where you're reignited and when you can recharge yourself because you're running out of steam and you've exhausted your resources. And now you're receiving something from other people that can give you a boost. And you can go back and work and be yourself and develop yourself. So there's a natural expansion in that, what we call transformation. The eighth house is also the house where you face your mortality. Now, it's interesting that it's not necessarily when you die, but it's when you experience death and loss around you. So the process of grieving is in the eighth house. Why is that? Because when you face your mortality, when you realize people actually die, we're not in here forever, it gives you a sense of urgency to overcome the challenges that are in front of you. So it's basically that aspect of the need to understand that things could end, that things will end if you don't do the work. Because it's a house that's relating to growth and transformation, it's also the house where you can face your own end. And, many of us went through eighth house experiences and we faced the end of a chapter. We faced the end of a relationship because we had to look at all the limitations of that relationship or that career or whatever wasn't exhausted itself. So it's you're reaching a certain death, and it applies on many different levels. It can be the death of a profession where you're reinventing yourself, or it can be the death of a relationship, or it can be the death of someone close to you. But these are scorpionic themes. Reaching the ninth house, after you went through, the dark tunnels of the eighth house, and you, experience that descent and that shadow work and facing all your limitation and your mortality, deep, intense emotional experiences. In the ninth house, you have that renewal and that feeling of hope again and feeling of optimism that, wow, I can do this. And look, I can go much farther than I thought. If this doesn't kill me, it's going to make me stronger. It's an eighth house thing. And that leads you to the ninth house, which is the house where you regain your confidence and you basically are ready to take on bigger challenges. So it's the house of distribution, of travel, of expansion, and faith. Faith from a religious point of view and from just a spiritual point of view, having faith in life. So the ninth house is the house that defines your belief systems, how attached you are to your belief, how you find meaning in your life. And it's also the house that has to do with expansion, whether that is material or whether it's cultural. It's also a house of education, which, it ties into the growth of understanding of life. So it gives you more authority in the wisdom, the school of wisdom. Now you're moving to the 10th house, it's a Capricorn house, and you move into a last quadrant that has no fire signs anymore. So the first house started with fire, Aries, association, and the 9th house is associated with Sagittarius and the fire sign of Sagittarius. And then you move into the 10, 11, 12, which have no fire. And this is why you enter the last quadrant, which is less personal. So you enter the Saturn house in the 10th house, which has to do with learning how to make life work. All the fruits of your labor, reach that climax point in the 10th house where it's all being tested. Can you actually deliver? All your ambitions, all your beliefs, let's see the results. So it's the house of results. And this is why it's a house where we can have our role models, authority figures, and our relationship with parents, with teachers, with the government, with people in position of authority who can serve as our guides, or the people we don't want to emulate. The parental patterns that we want to break rather than internalize. So the 10th house is our relationship with authority figures, but it's also how we become an authority, how we rise in status. And naturally, you rise in status once you prove that what you do actually works and people want to hear from you. They want to listen what you have to say or how you do things. This is why it has to do with mentorship and leadership and politics, but it also has to do with your own social status. And it's the status in your family as you become a parent. It's the status in your society, in your community. Are you becoming someone that people take seriously? And if you fake it, then there's a downfall in the 10th house. Some will obviously relate it to career. This is where also we rise in status, we become authorities. Obviously, this has career implications. Then the 11th house, is where we connect with our community. Once we become involved in society and role models and the structure of life, we then can create a community that is going to advance civilization. So the 11th house has to do with our vision, has to do with the need for progress and how we work together as a community, as a team, as friends to exchange our input, the think tank, in order to find solutions and advance our civilization. So in the 11th house, we see how we can bring progress. What are the new things we need to develop? If I have Taurus in the 11th house, maybe I need a more progressive, a more advanced way of managing resources or handling my physical body. This is where I'm going to gain more objective perspective on things. So a more scientific approach, a more rational approach, because I'm bouncing back with other friends and teams, and I'm objectifying on these subjects. So the 11th house is your relationship with your team. Is it good? Is it abusive? Is it a good support system? Or do you actually manage to create things together? Or you feel like you're stuck? You know, all these things, you're going to look at what's going on in your 11th house. You're going to look at the ruler of the 11th house, and then you're going to look also at the natural ruler, Uranus. Now, Uranus, people say, well, Uranus is so eccentric and it's so out of control and it creates fast change. Well, yeah, that's what the 11th house is about. It's about progress. It's about newness. And it's about creating reforms in our lives. So people with Virgo in the 11th house, or people with Uranus in Virgo, can be people who are extremely capable of developing more advanced technology. Anything that will bring, you know, the technical aspects of life, Virgo, to fix problems, to develop agriculture, to develop tools. You know, if you have Virgo in the 11th house, or maybe you want to bring new solutions to the way we address our health. And so we move from the 11th house to the 12th house, which is related to Pisces. It's related to dreams, to anything that is unconscious. But what is the unifying aspect of the 12th house? Some people say, well, Pisces is altruistic, but the 12th house is imprisonment and, you know, self-undoing. I mean, let's understand this a little more deeply. The 12th house and Pisces relate to all the things in life that are beyond our control. So it's basically about understanding how we relate to the larger forces of life, to the things that we do not know yet. And because we don't know them, we can't control them. Remember, knowledge gives you security. Gemini wanted knowledge to know where to go and what to do. And Aquarius wants knowledge in order to be able to find solutions and upgrade. So when you enter the 12th house, you enter the realm of the things you do not know. And you have to rely on nature, on the universe, or on someone else who knows. This is why it's a house where you have to surrender, because you're facing your limitation. It's very humbling not to know. And this is why it's a house where you have to trust. Now, if it's related to sleep and the unconscious, what do you do when you sleep? You surrender. People who can't trust cannot sleep. You know, their mind is working overtime, and the 12th house is where you have to let go of the mind. This is why there is also an association with imprisonment in the 12th house, because when you're in prison, you don't have control. Someone else takes over. So it's that feeling of being passive, being led, being even helpless. So there's a positive expression of letting go in the 12th house, where you trust the universe and you say, it's not in my hands, and I'm relinquishing my desires to a higher will. But there can be a very negative expression of letting go, where you're defeated, where someone takes over, when someone crushes your will. So it can be experienced as victimization. And both are 12th house experiences. The 12th house is also where because it's where you are beyond your control, it's also a house where you can connect with the collective consciousness. And there's a whole theory that I developed about that. Is the 12th house does relate to the service you offer to the collective, and it's also related to career. I won't go too deep into that. I want to keep things more basic, but that's reminding us that there is a possible or maybe very relevant connection between signs and houses. Now, again, some people, will argue about, the discrepancy between houses and signs, and that they don't have the same meaning. And again, I'm not trying to say, no, my way is the way, because maybe for the uses you have in astrology, there is a need to look at houses differently. But if you are using it for the purpose of soul development and understanding life processes and understanding, more psychological questions, I believe it's very useful to understand the correlation between houses and signs. So here I presented a division of houses per quadrant. So between the angles, the horizon and the IC. So the first quadrant relates to the houses of Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, is where you develop yourself and your resources. So you find out what you can do. You develop your will, yourself. It's the quadrant of self. So it's who I am, what I can do, first house, what I have, second house, and where am I going? Where is this going? How does this work? Third house. So it's your fuel, and this is a quadrant where you're very autonomous and you don't rely on other people so easily. You're more guarded, you're more defensive, you're more in survival mode. And again, many people who are very talented, even a lot of artists, have strong first quadrant because it's resource oriented. The second quadrant, which relates to Cancer, Leo, Virgo, is where you really find your willpower. And this is where you develop yourself and your support system. So you're not alone anymore. You have, a platform, whether it's family, whether it's people you trust, people who want to do what you're doing. And this is where you start to produce. So in the first quadrant, you recognize what you have and what your direction is. And the second quadrant is where you start to create and you become the master of your own destiny. You develop yourself, your ego, your delivery, and you're in production mode. So people who have a strong second quadrant are people who are very determined, usually know what they want, they won't compromise, and they're in a giving mode. Give, do, give. Everything comes out of themselves. Now, lower hemisphere, from first house to sixth house, is where people are most connected to themselves. There's greater individuality, authenticity. So the lower quadrant, again, more artistic, less compromised, more rebellious even, because you are very focused on what your life is about. It's more personal. When you move from the sixth you maximize your skills in the sixth and you reach a climax of production. This is why Virgos are the most skilled. You know, they can do everything. They can fix everything. And the sixth house is also what are our skills and how do we put them to work and how do we make our life work? Then we move to the seventh house where we start to, you know, we don't start. That's when we actually realize that there's so much I can do alone. Yes, I have a support system in the second quadrant, but in the third quadrant, that's when I actually get things that I do not have. The trade, where I basically, you know, cooperate with other people in order to do things together. So joining force makes us stronger. And so in the third quadrant is the I want, because I don't have it. It's the hunger for what you don't have. So there's a desire for growth and more in the third quadrant. So people with strong third quadrant can have a constant feeling of lack and a constant need to expand and to grow and to redefine themselves and to question everything. They don't take anything for granted because they know there's more. There's another layer. So this can even be a philosophical thing. And it's, of course, their own image. Your identity is changing in the third quadrant. You're becoming something else. You have a new incarnation in this incarnation. And you're learning, as we say, you're learning that cooperation is to your advantage. Then you reach the fourth quadrant, and that's when you bring all the labor of your work from first to ninth, and you start to integrate that into the greater sphere, the collective sphere. So the fourth quadrant is what you must, which means it's not up to you. It's not what you want. It's the things you align with. It's the things you have to do for the greater good. You know, it's more of a sense of duty rather than personal desire. So there's a need to bring the self in a larger context in the fourth quadrant. Now, people who are born with a strong fourth quadrant emphasis may have been raised in circumstances where there were many larger families, where they were part of a community, where they didn't get a lot of personal attention. You know, the personal attention is the lower hemisphere. When you have a fourth quadrant, you're more easily sacrificing yourself. You're more easily getting over your needs and realizing, well, there's something more important than me. So you integrate yourself to the greater whole. And you're maturing, because it's an act of maturity to be able to integrate into the whole. But it's only after you've completed the lower hemisphere and you know who you are and what you can do, that you can safely integrate into the collective. That's why you need to be a child before you become a professional adult. Otherwise, what people can experience in the fourth quadrant is a loss of self, forgetting what they want. Who am I? What do I really want out of life? Fourth quadrant people may look for role models because they're not fully in touch with themselves. They may have experienced neglect as children. But the positive way is that these are people who can, if it is grounded, these are people who will be more mature, who will have a big picture perspective, who will understand how to work in a more global theme, in a more global environment. And these are people who will serve their community more effectively. So in general, the higher hemisphere from 7 to 12 is where you gain maturity, when you start to reflect back on things, you look at the big picture perspective, and you're entering a more collective arena. So this is the no compromise, and this is the adaptation. You want to work with people, and so you need to make things work. It's not all up to you in the upper hemisphere. So, I explore this. I'm sharing ideas here, and maybe it makes sense to you, maybe it doesn't, and that's fine. You don't need to dislike this video to prove that I'm wrong. Just move on. Now, I wanted to show this particular video about Leo associated with children. This is a lady that wanted very much to have children. And she married relatively late, in her late 30s. She found her partner. And medically, doctors identified problems with her ability to get pregnant. So she really wanted to have children, to conceive, but she was starting to examine different alternatives, whether it's, bringing science, in vitro fertilization, adoption, all the wide range of possibilities. And when I did the reading for her, which was, 2012-ish, I saw that this Jupiter is going to get into Leo. It's going to get on her sun first in 2013, and then it's going to, in 13 and 14, and then it's going to move into Leo. And to me, this was a time that would indicate that her fertility and her capacity to have a child, whether it's through medical means or whether it's a natural conception, there are high chances that this will happen. That 2014, as Jupiter is in Cancer, Leo, and then 2015, Jupiter crosses her ascendant. So the Leo factor was very central for my analysis of fertility. So she got pregnant naturally around early September, when Venus was in Leo on her ascendant. She conceived naturally. And Jupiter was squaring her MC angles. And the child was born 9 months later with Jupiter close to the ascendant. The other thing that really was compelling for me is the progressions. In September, she had a new moon in Leo, in the 12th house. Remember, the 12th house is where you have no control. And Leo is fertility. So in her mind, she didn't expect to get pregnant because she thought she couldn't. But in a very 12th house way, it happened outside her control. And this new moon in Leo, to me, represented a clear message of fertility and a higher probability of being able to conceive or being able to, have a child. And it's what happened on the clock, September, exactly with this new moon cycle. It happened. And Mercury, by progression, was also about to move on Venus. And interestingly, her partner is a Gemini, and her son, born from this, is also a Gemini. So when she gave birth, Mercury was exactly on the Venus. And she conceived a Gemini. She delivered a Gemini. Another example of a lady who had tremendous difficulty getting pregnant, and also, had diabetes, and therefore, there's a high risk pregnancy, if at all. And we were looking at the charts and conversing, and I saw that progress moon in Leo. It was around 2003. And I said to her, I told her, within 4 months, I trust that you will be able to get pregnant. And she said, no, there's no chance. It's difficult. It won't happen. Then she called me back and she says, guess what? I am pregnant. So the time we had this conversation, she didn't know it when we were having the conversation, but she was actually already pregnant. And yeah, the moon was there. It wasn't yet on the ascendant, but it was square Venus. And then she conceived, and she has a son, and yeah, everything happened with this Leo activation. So it's just what I wanted to say is that from an evolutionary point of view, we do look at Leo as a fertile sign, similar to the 5th house. So these are examples, and I know this is not statistical research. I won't give you numbers and quantitative references, but it's, I hope, enough to make you think about the possibility that houses and signs do have an archetypal meaning and should be examined that way. So I encourage you to basically do your own research. That's my point. And I'm giving you here pointers. Look at this from a synastry point of view. Look at this in family patterns. Look at this also reference to transits and natal. And see, take note of the experiences. Take note of what you see and if it applies to you. Always the proof is in the pudding. So you want to test this with actual charts. Don't take anyone's word, not the ancients and not Maurice and not any book. We are here as teachers to open doors and to make you think. But it's your mind and it's your decision. So I hope this inspires you and this gave you something to think about and to apply in your charts. Thank you.